The Spoken Word Library presents The Bremer Connection by Tim Heinan. Working as an undercover operative for the Milwaukee Police Department, Tim Heinan penetrated deeply into the radical student movement. He worked within the Students for a Democratic Society, the Revolutionary Youth Movement, the Weathermen, the Black Panthers, and the Communist Party. It was at one of these meetings that he first observed a young man who several years later was to burst into headlines as the attempted assassin of Governor George Wallace. Heinan reveals that Arthur Bremer was under the direct guidance and discipline of hardcore communists. But when his reports were not made public, and when the federal government insisted that Bremer was a lone fanatic with no ideological or organizational connections, he decided to reveal his undercover role and to take his story directly to the American people. This presentation is not a political endorsement of George Wallace. In fact, he has shown no interest in having this story known. Perhaps this is because of a natural desire just to forget about that tragic event. Perhaps he feels that if he personally helped to expose the Bremer connection, he might lose support within the Democratic Party, where the radical left has become so strong. But whatever the case, this story is more important than Bremer, Heinan, or even Wallace himself. It cuts across all political lines and cannot be construed as support for or opposition to any particular party or candidate. Since Tim Heinan began to speak out, there have been repeated attempts on his life and those of his family. His home has been destroyed by bomb. Someone doesn't want Tim Heinan to tell his story, which perhaps is reason enough for us to hear him out. The Spoken Word Library is proud to present now The Bremer Connection by Tim Heinan.
I'm here tonight to support the charges that were made in Washington, D.C. by Congressman John Schmitz. Charges that Arthur Bremer was not a loner, that in fact he was a part of a conspiracy to shoot Governor Wallace, and that the people involved in that conspiracy were self-proclaimed Marxist, Leninist communists. I'd like to give you some idea before we go on tonight of what kind of a character you do have standing in front of you. So I'll tell you, I'm 25 years old, and I was born and raised in Duluth, Minnesota. That's a good place to be from. So in 1965, I moved out and went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I attended Marquette University. Marquette is a Catholic college. It's about 10,000 students, and it's located in downtown Milwaukee. It's operated by the Jesuits. It was at Marquette that I became involved with the New Left movement and the Communist movement. In 1968, a group of students and non-students who were members of the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS chapter on our campus, stormed into a class that I was attending along with 60 or 70 other students who had paid hard money to go to school. Some had borrowed their money for tuition, some had worked all summer. And when they stormed into the class was disrupted and dismissed, and a fight broke out between people who wanted an education and people who wanted a disruption. This particular fight grew in size, and it grew in scope and moved out to the street, and eventually it became necessary to summon the Milwaukee Police Department. As I stood watching this go on, something or someone hit me in the head. I was knocked down for just a moment. But one of the police officers that was on the scene came over to talk to me, to see if I was seriously injured, which I was not. And in the course of our conversation, it became apparent to him that I was one of the people on campus who just wasn't too happy with the behavior of SDS. And so he explained a few things to me. He explained that that evening, a man named Dakin Gentry, a local leader in the Black Panther Party, would be speaking at Marquette University. You see, at Marquette, they used to provide all kinds of good intellectual things for the students. And he also explained that it would be of some interest to the police department to know what types of people, how many people would go hear a Black Panther and what their reaction would be. And he stated that by sending a police officer, it might change the size and content of the audience. So he asked me if I would be willing to attend that one meeting. Well, I grew up in a family where I was taught that if a police officer makes a reasonable request of you, you comply. So I agreed to go to that meeting. The following day, I was contacted by detectives from the Special Assignment Squad, which is the Subversive Activities Intelligence Unit of the Milwaukee Police Department. And they seemed to know a little bit more about me than I knew about myself when they came to my apartment that day. And after they told me my life history, they asked me if I'd be willing to continue to go to some meetings. So I agreed, and they gave me a non-published phone number that I could contact them at. They gave me a code number H680 to use when I was contacting them and some brief instructions. But basically, they told me to stay with the SDS leaders on campus, to see where that would take me. Well, in a very short period of time, it took me into the SDS membership. And after about a year, it took me on to the 5-man steering committee that controlled the local SDS chapter. From there, I got involved in several other Marxist organizations, communist organizations in the Milwaukee area, and I'll discuss some of those organizations this evening briefly. The SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, were being described by publications such as Time magazine as disenchanted young liberals. And I'm sure some of the newer members, some of the fringe members in the SDS considered themselves to be just that. Oh, they understood that they were shouting communist rhetoric, but there were few that came to a complete awareness of the fact that the local leaders of the SDS chapter at Marquette were members of the Communist Party. And as I later learned, this was true of every SDS chapter across the country. The local leaders were either members of the Boys Club or one of the communist parties in this country. I say one because in 1968 there were several disciplined communist organizations that were trying to gain control of SDS. SDS is not a disciplined organization. It is a mass organization, an umbrella group that has been used by the communists to carry out activities which they can't carry out very well under their own banner. I was present at the last SDS convention in Chicago in 1969 when the super pro-Maoists, the Progressive Labor Party-controlled Worker-Student Alliance faction, split away from the rest of SDS. And the other half called themselves Revolutionary Youth Movement. That split pretty soon into what you know as the Weathermen. And another group called RYM2, Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, which is the faction I then lined up with. RYM2 SDS was completely controlled by the Communist Party. It was headed nationally by a fellow named Mike Klonsky, whose father, Bob Klonsky, is one of the best-known communists in the state of California. There were several people in the Communist Party that I did work with and meet who were national leaders. One little gal from the party that used to come into Milwaukee quite frequently was Charlene Mitchell, who ran on the CPUSA ticket for president in 1968. I had one occasion to work with Carl Braden, who's been quite active in this part of the country. One of the other individuals that I had an opportunity to work with reasonably close was Tom Heinan, one of the founders of SDS. Now, Tom is pretty well known by the young people in the country today, and in going around the country, I've noticed a couple of things that are encouraging to me. First of all, most of the young people today are aware of a lot of the issues. They're looking for answers. They know there's something not quite right with the establishment. They haven't been getting answers that are totally satisfactory to them in school. Most of them haven't had a chance to get answers that they can accept in their homes. So they're interested in what we have to say. They know about Tom Heinan. They're aware, for instance, that Tom Heinan, as an SDS leader, traveled to Havana and to Prague, Moscow, Hanoi, Peking. They know that Tom Heinan sponsored the congressional campaign for Communist Party theoretician Herb Aptheker, and they know that he sponsored the presidential campaign for Black Panther Party leader Eldridge Cleaver. But in talking to them, I find that they're a little bit surprised to learn a few things about Tom Heinan. They're surprised to learn that it was this same Tom Heinan who, while he was on trial for conspiracy, had the habit of flying off to places like Paris and New York in order to have lunch with Averell Harriman. They're surprised to learn that it was the same Tom Heinan who was chosen to be a member of the honor guard at Robert Kennedy's funeral. And they say, well, what is this all about? Why Tom Heinan? Why one of our own leaders hanging around with big money and big names? And I said, well, let's just take a look into this thing. You remember a lot of the kids didn't completely understand that the local leaders were members of the Communist Party? Maybe there's something that some of the people in the Communist Party didn't all understand either. So one of the things that I carry around with me is a copy of the Washington Star. I keep a copy of the September 29th, 1968 edition because it's that edition that documents that billionaire Cyrus Eaton, a man who began his career as a secretary to John Rockefeller, donated in 1968 $40,000 to the SDS national headquarters. And the kids say, wow, us getting Rockefeller money? Now there's something really wrong. You sure that's right? And I say, yeah, let's go down to the nearest bookstore and we can pick up a copy of a book that's been a bestseller for over a year. It's a book called The Strawberry Statement. It was written by an SDS leader. And in it he states that he was offered Esso money, Rockefeller money, to promote and prolong the Chicago 1968 Democratic Convention riots. I say, how about taking a look at something that was written by someone while they were still in SDS? Because I got a copy of a news release, as every member of every steering committee across the country did in September of 1969. A news release that was issued by the Worker Student Alliance of SDS when the feud between the factions was at a peak, stating, quite frankly and flatly, that Mark Rudd and his Weathermen were completely financed and controlled by international bankers. Or we talk sometimes about Ted Gold. Now, there may be people here tonight who don't remember Ted's name. You would have heard it in the news a couple of years ago when he and several of his Weathermen friends blew themselves apart in a townhouse in Greenwich Village while they were making bombs. It seems Ted was in a $41,000 townhouse located next door to the one owned by movie star Dustin Hoffman. I suppose that's where Ted felt he'd be closest to the people. You know? Well, he had his little accident, and all they found of him was his thumb. Ted never was very good at making bombs. But before that, he'd made a statement that was picked up by the wire services. He said, if it takes fascism to accomplish our aims in this country, then let's have fascism. Now, that doesn't sound like an SDS leader, certainly not a Weatherman leader, does it? But you see, there must have been a couple of people near the top who knew what the score was, who knew that SDS, like every other communist organization that has existed in this country or around the world, has been controlled, financed, and in many cases even organized by big money, international banker money, conspiracy money. And I'm talking now about a master conspiracy, one which seats itself in such organizations as the Council on Foreign Relations. Now tonight, I'm not going to try and convince anyone here of that conspiracy. Those of you who know about it, know about it. Those of you who would like to, there is enough information available even here tonight. The evidence is now so staggering and so irrefutable that it's available for your own investigation. So I'm not going to try and persuade anyone to believe in it. But it's a conspiracy which plays an important part in the story that I'm going to be talking about tonight. It's a conspiracy which is trying today to turn this country into a prison, into a totalitarian government, using a technique called pressure from above and pressure from below. Hitler used it. Trotsky used it after top people in our own government made sure that he got over to Russia in 1917 to carry on a revolution there after he left from New York. It's even such a basic technique that it's used to capture wild animals. You know how they capture tigers for your zoos? The great rich white hunter goes over to India and he recruits the grubbiest, dirtiest, lowest parts of the Indian society. And he finances them and gives them drums and noisemakers and sends them out into the field that the tiger he wants to capture is located in. And there they begin to beat their drums and make their noise and move in very slowly. And the tiger starts to react out of fear. And he runs looking for a place to hide. And the only escape he can find is in the cage that has been prepared for him. This is a technique that is being used today. This is the purpose of the revolution in the streets. This is why it's financed. This is why it exists. Because whether the terrorist acts are bombings, assassination attempts, hijackings, riots, no matter what the action is, the reaction is always the same. It's predictable. The American people will call out for more law and order, and the very benevolent federal government will be happy to give you at least more law. What happens is the government increases in size and in scope and in power, and the only people who benefit from that are the individuals who gain in personal power. Those Council on Foreign Relations members that are sitting in control of the top positions in our government today. One of the questions that comes up in discussing the revolution in the streets, how can a clergyman, someone who's dedicated their life, supposedly dedicated their life to God, work so hard for an atheistic movement? I worked with a number of clergymen. Now, most of the ones that I worked with in the communist movement were Catholic priests. I was on a Catholic college campus. Had I been on some other campus run by a different denomination, I would have run into Protestant ministers or Jewish rabbis doing the same thing, because today there are no major religious denominations that have not been infiltrated by the party. And this is exactly how it's done. It might be difficult for you to understand how a clergyman could become a communist, but believe me, there is nothing today to stop a communist from becoming a clergyman, and it's done all the time. I can name at least 3 priests I worked with who were members of the Communist Party before they ever went to a seminary. Now, there are other clergymen who I worked with that I don't think were ever communists. Their motives were somewhat different. One name that you'll recognize, I think, is Father Jim Groppe. Now, Groppe, you might understand his motives a little better if I explain that today his bank account in Milwaukee is estimated to have between $70,000 and $140,000 in it. Last year, I believe he admitted to $100,000. And I got to know Groppe pretty well. We marched together. He was near the Marquette area, and he taught me an awful lot of the techniques. But one of the techniques that became very apparent to me was on a march I participated in the fall of 1969 with Father Groppe. He called it the Welfare Mothers March. This was a demonstration where he led a parade from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to the state capitol in Madison to protest the fact that the state legislature was proposing welfare cutbacks. And together we marched in to the state capitol building. And in one day, Groppe and the SDSers caused $26,000 worth of damage to the Capitol building. They disrupted the state legislature for several days. The National Guard had to be called out, and Father Groppe was arrested because he had violated probation from one of his previous arrests. But it was a successful day for the SDSers, because while we were sitting in the state legislature and singing "We Shall Overcome," we conducted a series of meetings to plan the fall 1969 offensive. New programs that were going to be brought in. We planned things like the final stages of the Chicago Days of Rage. That was headed by the Weathermen, but other factions took part. And there was another program that was new, women's liberation, one that we kicked off the following year but made plans for in Madison that day was Lenin's birthday. Now, I know Walter Cronkite told you it was called Earth Day, but it was Lenin's birthday and we knew it. One of the more significant programs and successful in Wisconsin for the SDS that we planned there was a program called Operation Jailbreak. Jailbreak got its name from its slogan, "School is Jail." It was a program to radicalize non-university students, high school students, trade school students, and non-students. And the SDS would go into the schools, we'd go in the afternoons, pick likely prospects and invite them to come to our open SDS meetings, which of course were complete shows because the decisions were actually made by the steering committee in closed meetings. But we would invite these people to open SDS meetings, and sometimes other students in the schools, in the high schools and trade schools, would hear about these meetings, and they'd come too, even though we hadn't specifically invited them. And they were welcome, as long as we found out who they were. And so they assigned the people on the steering committees to go over and get to know anyone who was new or who had come uninvited. One of the meetings in November of 1969, a new face came in, and I went over to talk to him. And this was one Arthur Herman Bremer. And I talked to Bremer, and I observed his presence and attitude at the meeting and some of the discussion that went on. And I included this in my daily report to the Milwaukee Police Department. And of course, as was a matter of policy, each of my reports was summarized and then sent to the local office of the FBI. Bremer, at the first meeting that I observed him at, was what you would have to call a naive kid. He didn't completely understand the New Left movement, didn't quite fit in, but he wanted to. He wanted to become a part of it. He wanted eventually to be a leader in the New Left movement, and he stated it. The most obvious thing about him, and a lot of us noticed it, was a tremendous need for attention. Well, Arthur Bremer continued to come to SDS meetings, and I observed him in the future attending them, and he began to get the type of attention that he was looking for. After the meetings, sometimes the top SDS leaders and some of the top radicals in the Milwaukee area would go over and spend time with Arthur and talk to him. When I graduated in June of 1970, I lost all interest in Arthur Bremer. I tried to forget a lot of what I'd seen in SDS. Some of it bothered me very much. And I didn't think much about Bremer until May 15th, when the shooting occurred, when I saw his picture on the television. And my wife turned to me and said, "Tim, you ought to call the Milwaukee Police Department and remind them of those reports that you turned in." And I said, "No, that's not necessary. They're very efficient. They have some kind of a cross-index file or something, I suppose, and it'll all come out." Well, we watched the newspapers for several days and the television, and we learned Arthur Bremer's sex life, and we learned what he ate for breakfast and how he combed his hair. But we didn't ever learn anything about what I knew and what other people in Milwaukee knew, that Arthur Bremer had, at least at one time, become very close to and very involved with the Students for Democratic Society. And I thought, well, that's certainly newsworthy. Maybe there isn't such a good cross-index down there. I'll call the Milwaukee Police Department, and I did so. And when I did that, I had what was to me one of the most frightening experiences I've ever had in my life. And I'll describe it after I make a couple of comments. First of all, in my personal opinion, the Milwaukee Police Department is the finest metropolitan police department in this country today. And I am very proud to have been associated with them and Chief Harold Breyer in any way. Second of all, I'd like to describe the nature of an intelligence unit in a major metropolitan police department. Now, this is generally true in large cities. The intelligence unit is not a part of the regular chain of command. They are an elite group who answer either to no one or only to the chief. And they are very dependent upon the cooperation and aid of federal agencies such as the FBI and the Secret Service for intelligence information and cooperation. They need that in order to justify their own existence. Now, that is not necessarily a good situation when any part of a local police department becomes dependent upon the cooperation of any part of the federal government. With all that said, I will explain what did happen when I called the Milwaukee Police Department. I was told that I should forget that I ever saw Arthur Bremer. I was told that they had received orders, quote unquote, from above to discontinue their own investigation into the Arthur Bremer case. In fact, One detective even told me that agents from the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division of IRS, or they were IRS at that time, came into our police department, sealed and confiscated the files of the Milwaukee Police Department that pertained to Arthur Bremer. I don't know by what authority, and I'm not too convinced that they have such an authority. But this is what occurred. I was told not to embarrass the federal agencies who were conducting their investigation, that if they wanted to talk to me, they would. But to date, the only people from the federal government who are willing to talk to me have been investigators from the House Internal Security Committee, whom I've spent several days working with. But you might ask yourself why I haven't been questioned, why I was not subpoenaed to the state trial. And tonight I'm going to mention several other people who knew a great deal about Arthur Bremer, who had the same experience. Some of the people you would most expect to have been key witnesses or to have had the most information were just avoided during the phony investigation. The next thing that happened after I called the police department was that Alan Stang, who was a contributing editor for American Opinion magazine and Review of the News magazine, came into Milwaukee to investigate the Arthur Bremer case, to see if there was any more to it than what had been already released to the news media. So Stang came to talk to me. And when he did, after I interviewed him, he showed me some information that he already had, which was very interesting to me. So I asked him if I could join him on the remainder of his investigation. And together, we spent over 6 weeks, day and night, talking to literally everyone that we could find in the Milwaukee area and then around the country who knew anything about Arthur Bremer. We talked to Bremer's family, we talked to his employers, his neighbors, we talked to his friends. He had a lot of friends. And we could not find anyone in Milwaukee who would describe Arthur Bremer in any way as a loner. We could not find anyone who would describe him as being mentally substandard. In fact, what we learned was that he had an above-average IQ, that he had done better than average in school, that he had done some very clever and witty writing. We saw some examples of it. And we learned that the week before he was arrested, he had been reading Huxley's Brave New World, which is not the sort of book mental midgets sit down to read. One of the things that Mr. Stang did when he got done compiling this information was to publish as much of it as possible in the October issue of the American Opinion magazine, and that is available here tonight. For those of you who would like to see the facts in black and white, there are addresses, times, photostatic reproductions, photographs, a lot of information that I just won't be able to get into in deep detail while I'm talking tonight. One of the things Alan Stang reproduced in here was a 4-page report from a federal agent. This was a report in which a federal agent observed Arthur Bremer meeting in secret with one of the best-known revolutionaries in Milwaukee. Meeting in 1971, in the summer of 1971, and guess what they were talking about? George Wallace, and violence, and a violent revolution. It seems that Arthur Bremer met in a tavern near the Marquette area with a man named Michael Cullen. Now, I knew Cullen pretty well. He was one of the 14 individuals involved in the Milwaukee 14 draft file burning incident several years ago. Cullen and Bremer were observed by this federal agent, according to the report, reading a copy of the Daily World, which is the Communist Party daily newspaper. But the newspaper they were reading was 3 years old at the time they were reading it in July of '71. And the headlines on that particular edition were George Wallace, the Telltale Record. And a quick check at the Milwaukee City Library showed me that that entire issue was filled with almost nothing but propaganda stories against George Wallace. And in the course of their conversation, the federal agent documents here, Bremer was making statements that he would like to become deeper involved and more active in the violent revolution in this country, in a Black Panther-style revolution. And Cullen was overheard making the statement, "Getting arrested is nothing to fear." Now that was an interesting remark. It was interesting because a few weeks later, Arthur Bremer was arrested. Now, it was my experience in the communist movement that no one was ever given any significant assignment until they had been tested. Bremer's willingness to be arrested must surely have been tested. And so we went to talk to the suburban Milwaukee Police Department, the Fox Point Police Department, who was responsible for arresting Arthur Bremer for carrying a concealed weapon. We talked to the chief, we talked to the patrolman involved, and what we learned was this. Arthur Bremer went out and parked his car in a no parking zone, where he sat for several hours with ammunition spread all over the front seat of his car. And eventually a patrolman came by and said, "What are you doing parked in a no parking zone with ammunition spread all over the front seat of your car?" And Bremer said, "I'm sitting here carrying a concealed weapon." So much to his amazement, he was arrested. And that established him as a gun-carrying nut. Bremer had been questioned since then by other police officers. He was questioned when he was in Kalamazoo, Michigan this spring following Governor Wallace, while the governor was having a rally in Kalamazoo. And he talked to a police officer there, but the only other person that Arthur Bremer spoke to in Kalamazoo was a girl named Lori McNally. Now, Lori is presently being sought in this part of the country by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for some of her activities with the Communist Young Workers' Liberation League. While we conducted our investigation, we went to talk to Bremer's employers, and I know I'm throwing out a lot of names tonight at you. I'm going to throw out another one, Tim Burns. Tim is an important name because he probably knew Arthur Bremer better than anyone outside of the communist movement. He and Bremer would talk to each other when Bremer was no longer speaking to even his own family. Burns was Bremer's supervisor at the Story Elementary School, where Bremer worked for a year and a half as a part-time janitor. During that time, he missed 2 days' work. He was supposed to work 3.5 to 4 hours every evening. Instead, he would usually stay around 7 or 8 hours because he and Burns would get into conversations and arguments. So we went in to talk to Mr. Burns, sat down in his living room this summer and asked him, said, "Mr. Burns, what kind of a man was Arthur Bremer?" And Burns said, "He was a communist." I said, "Mr. Burns, that's a pretty strong statement. Why do you say that?" He said, "Because Arthur Bremer said so." He was a self-proclaimed communist. We used to argue about it all the time. We used to get into arguments because he believed that all the private property in the United States should be equally distributed. We used to argue about some of the things he'd get out of his Black Panther Party newspaper. I said, "Mr. Burns, did you give this information to the FBI and the Secret Service when they questioned you a month ago?" And he said, "Exactly as I'm telling you." Tim Burns did not appear at the Bremer trial. Arthur Bremer's mother stated that she had some reason to believe in a conspiracy, and she wanted to know who those strange, hippie-looking people that followed Arthur Bremer around in a blue car were. But Arthur Bremer's mother was not at the trial. While I was working with Alan Stang this summer and the other people who helped us on our investigation, I was employed by a credit agency in Milwaukee, so I thought it would be interesting to look into Bremer's financial background. And I checked and I learned that Bremer did not have any credit cards. I learned that he had only saved a few dollars at any time in a bank, that he had not taken out any loans. His family said that they were not giving him any money. And we looked at the federal income tax returns that were found in Bremer's apartment. And we verified the figures that were on them by talking to his employers. And what we learned was this. We learned that in 1971, Bremer had a gross before tax income of $3,016.44. In 1972, he earned nothing. He quit his job the first week of January and was totally unemployed up until the May 15th shooting. So he had a gross income of $3,016.44. A third of that was used up in his rent. Now, he used to lie to the people he knew, such as Mr. Burns, about how much rent he paid. He used to tell people he only paid about half of what he was actually paying. And we added up the figures of the expenses that we could account for that Arthur Bremer had, where we knew exactly what he paid for various items. If we didn't know, we just left it off the list. And if we add up that list now with the things that Alan Stang and I can today account for, we come to a figure that is some $600 more than his gross income. And of course we were being conservative. We assumed in that list, for example, that Arthur Bremer did not eat for a year and a half. I mean, we didn't know what he paid for groceries exactly, so we just left that out. Yeah. We only took into account little things like the expensive camera equipment that he purchased, the 3 guns that he purchased, none of which were Saturday night specials, the high-powered binoculars, police band radio, the dates he took his girlfriend out to in some of the best places in Milwaukee, the airfare across the country while he was following Governor Wallace in a plane, his travel expenses while he was traveling by car across the country, when he stayed at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel for 2 nights, the Lord Elgin Hotel, hotels and motels nearly every night, 3 trips across Lake Michigan on a ferry boat, with his car that he paid cash for. Those of you who paid for your last automobile in cash, how many of you also paid your attorney $250 the same week while you were working as a part-time janitor? Now, I don't know what conclusion you draw from that information, but I say Arthur Bremer was being financed. And if he was not, then I would like to second Congressman John Schmitz's recommendation that we make him Secretary of the Treasury. Question will come up, well, who was giving Bremer the money? And a specific individual, I don't know yet. We're hoping to find out, but I suppose the first suspect to look at would be the man who Bremer was seen with most often while he was pursuing the governor this spring. You may have read after the shooting that a number of people in different places identified or saw a mystery man, the gray figure that was seen in parts of the country with Bremer, the man who was overheard in different places giving him instructions. The newspapers called him Bremer's mentor, his fellow traveler, if you'll excuse the expression. He was described by various individuals, but the best description came from a man in Milwaukee, Earl Nunnery. Earl S. Nunnery is the station manager for the Chesapeake and Ohio Ferry Station, the boat that Bremer took across Lake Michigan 3 times. And he overheard this mystery man giving Bremer instructions and saw them together. And he gave such a beautiful, detailed description that many people in Milwaukee recognized who he was describing because he included the type of tie tack the man wore, how he combed his hair, what type of mustache he had, and what sort of accent he had. And I recognized the description too. I recognized it as a description of a man who had served on the steering committee of SDS with me, a man that I'd known for over a year and a half in SDS, a man who had been a member of the Communist Progressive Labor Party, a man who had traveled down to Cuba as part of Vincent Ramos' brigade, supposedly to cut sugar cane. I knew him as Dennis Cushman. His real name was Dennis Salvatore Cassini, and he used several other aliases. And I said to Alan Stang, well, this is great. All we have to do now is take a picture of Dennis, and we'll take some other pictures of people who look a little like that around to these people who saw the mystery man. And we'll have an identification, and we'll have something really good here. And Stang said, that's great. Well, we tried the FBI and the Milwaukee Police Department, but of course they had no pictures available for us. So we decided to go out and try and find Dennis ourselves, and we'd take a picture. And we talked to many of the revolutionaries that I knew. We talked to people across the city, the hippie areas, and one thing happened. We couldn't find Dennis, but we started a bit of a commotion. The word was going around. These guys are looking for Dennis. It was going through the radical movement. It was going through police agencies. These guys want to find Dennis for something. Well, then Dennis turned up about 10 days after we started asking for him. He turned up dead in Toronto, Canada. The first of a series of strange deaths that have started to crop up in the Bremer case. Dennis was found dead from an overdose of heroin. A strange death for someone who wasn't a drug user. I knew Dennis. He didn't use drugs, and the people who have known him since then have said the same thing. In fact, he was one of the most outspoken critics on the Marquette campus about drug use, or even the possession of drugs. He used to come into the SDS meetings and say, "We've got a serious revolution to carry on here. We can't afford drug arrests, especially if they come at bad times. I don't want anybody in this organization touching the stuff." And in our chapter, we didn't have a lot of drug use anyway. There was a hippie drug use culture that used to hang around with SDS because of a mutual dislike for the police department, but among the members, we didn't have much anyway. But Dennis would preach about it constantly, and yet he turned up dead from an overdose of heroin. I don't think he would have smoked marijuana. I know he wasn't what they call a smack freak, a heroin user. That's how he died. And the people who first discovered his body noticed on it a number of items that are mentioned in the article, but one was an address book that had some phone numbers in it. Phone numbers such as the number of the local leader of SDS who lived 2 blocks from Arthur Bremer in Milwaukee. The phone number of one Liebel Bergman. Now, Bergman has been called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee and pleaded the Fifth. He was a man who lived in Red China for several years, came back to the United States, and in California he set up an organization called Revolutionary Union, which has been cited as a communist assassination squad. There was the phone number of a girl in Dallas, Texas, who is one who arranges disappearances for the Communist Party, disappearances of people who are being sought by federal agents. The reason I brought up all these phone numbers at all was because one belonged to a man in California named John McCleary. McCleary's name had already come up before we even got his phone number on Dennis's body, or before we learned about that. And we now have learned that John McCleary isn't with us either. If we accept the police report, we have to accept that John McCleary decided to walk into the Pacific Ocean at 12 o'clock midnight and not get out. We also have to assume that his father, who he was so close to, well, let's put it this way. If you don't believe in conspiracies, you will have to believe that drowning is a hereditary factor in the McCleary family, because his father turned up drowned about 2 weeks ago in Reno, Nevada, where there's hardly any water. And at this time, we have people, American Opinion Investigative staff, out in Laurel, Maryland, looking into the death by overdose of a woman who was present on May 15th when the shooting occurred. Oh, she wasn't up front where the rally was going on. She was back in the shopping center. She was back there in a position where she could see a lot of other things happening. For example, the blue Cadillac that was seen speeding away from the scene of the crime. A blue Cadillac that 2 states put an all-points bulletin out for and then canceled for no explanation. A blue Cadillac whose driver just happened to have the physical description of Dennis Cassini, a driver who was seen changing the license plates on that car. And 14 days after the shooting, she turned up dead from an overdose. This woman's husband has told us that he's not satisfied with the possibility that that could have been a suicide. These deaths were not totally unexpected. They fit a pattern. There were some 36 strange deaths after the shooting of John Kennedy. There were some strange ones after the shooting of Bobby Kennedy, including the girl in the polka dot dress who died of an overdose. She was one of the key witnesses there at the Ambassador Hotel. Martin Luther King, for example, the 2 people who most likely would have called for a reopening of Ray's trial or put enough pressure on it would have been, I suppose, the judge who died of that sudden heart attack, or Martin Luther King's brother, who just accidentally fell into an empty swimming pool. You know? So these unexplainable or unbelievable deaths were not too surprising to us when they showed up. The pattern wasn't so surprising either. It wasn't so surprising, really, to learn that here we had someone who had attended SDS meetings and then worked very closely with revolutionaries for several years. That was the case with Lee Harvey Oswald. That was the case with Sirhan. Yet the American people have been asked to accept that all these self-proclaimed communists following this pattern were all loners. We're supposed to accept that they just were not properly toilet trained. You know? Ever since the Warren Commission published an entire encyclopedia to prove that the obvious didn't happen in Dallas, Texas, the American people have been calling out for the truth. And the federal government has answered them with a stony silence or a series of lies. Do you know that I will be 97 years old before the physical evidence of the Kennedy assassination is released for the American people to finally find out what that will tell? Secrecy is not the tool of a government of, by, and for the people. Secrecy is the tool of a dictatorship. What I'm about to say now, I would imagine will upset those of you who are fans of Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. and who tune in every Sunday night to watch that show. I'm talking, of course, about the FBI. The reason I brought up the FBI, which was for many years a tremendous beneficial force in this country, is because of a statement that was released a few weeks ago by the now acting director of the FBI. You know, this was an organization that was headed by a man who for years resisted the pressure that was put upon him to turn the Federal Bureau of Investigation into a national police force. J. Edgar Hoover recognized the danger of a Gestapo in this country, and he knew that the FBI should not become one. He's not there anymore. He's not there anymore, and it is foolish to look at the FBI today any different than you look at any other agency of the federal government. Now, I want to preface my remarks by saying that FBI agents, and I know several, for the most part are very dedicated, patriotic, and professional law enforcement men. And they're men who recognize that there's very little advantage in becoming a hero or trying to buck the system, especially within the disciplinary system in the FBI. They'd get very little attention anyway. I got off on this whole thing because of this letter from L. Patrick Gray, the acting director of the FBI, Richard Nixon's buddy. Mr. Gray, and I know that you'll be interested in this, issued a statement saying that he, as acting director of the FBI, had never heard or had no knowledge of any communist connections, affiliations, or associations on the part of Arthur Bremer. In spite of the fact that my reports on Bremer were turned over to his agency some 3 years ago, in spite of the fact that his agents talked to the very same people that Alan Stang and I talked to in Milwaukee, one might begin to think that the word got passed down somehow within the FBI not to find certain types of evidence. How else can you explain professional agents washing the hands and face of Arthur Bremer before they tested his skin with the paraffin test to find whether or not there was any presence of gunpowder? A critical test for the court case. How else do you explain that agents of the FBI searched Bremer's car and could not find the handgun that local authorities found immediately on a subsequent search? Or, as the Chicago Tribune first reported, agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation went over to Bremer's apartment on May 15th in the afternoon, and there they walked in, took a look around, and then left, leaving no one there. And the very enterprising young lady who manages that building and whom I've had a chance to meet then charged curiosity seekers, Marquette students, and members of the press $10 apiece to come in and loot the place. Now, after most of the evidence and most of the things in Bremer's apartment had been removed, and some new footprints and fingerprints had been added, then the FBI decided they would come back and collect evidence. And the people who had seen the mystery man across the country gave us a very interesting report. It seems that FBI agents went to them and told them that they were all liars. They didn't know each other and lived in different places, and somehow they had all made up the same lie, that there was no Dennis, really. In fact, we even came in contact with a federal agent in Milwaukee who states that he was given orders to pull the original files in his local file of every document that had Dennis's name on it and send those originals into Washington. And Mr. Earl Nunnery, the man who gave that best description of Dennis, states that FBI agents went to his neighbors and told his neighbors that he and his wife were drunks who have illusions. Now, if that is not quite the role that you would like to see federal investigators playing in society today, wait till we talk for a moment about the United States Secret Service. Because the Secret Service has never had anyone leading them that protested the fact that they might become a national police force. They've never had anyone, in fact, in charge that protests the fact that they are already a part of an international police force. Because for those of you who are not aware of it, the United States Secret Service is the American arm of Interpol. But more seriously is the nature or the behavior of the United States Secret Service recently. They're earning their initials. They've started to get in a very bad habit of having people committed for indefinite periods of psychiatric examination, people who have never been found guilty of any crimes. And they are the ones who I charge with being primarily responsible for the fact that Arthur Bremer's girlfriend, someone who must have known an awful lot about him, could not come down to the trial, has not been able or willing to talk to members of the press. You see, her name was Joan Pemrich, and she was only 15 years old. And in conducting their investigation, agents of the United States SS went over to Joan Pemrich's apartment. We couldn't talk to her. We talked to her mother and her father independently to get this information. And it seems that these agents hauled this 15-year-old girl into her bedroom, closed the door, and there they interrogated her for several hours. And they refused to allow her mother or her father to be present. They had men with automatic weapons to make sure. They were told that they could not have an attorney present in the home that day. Now, if that doesn't smack of Gestapo tactics, I don't know what does, but I think it's the type of information you have a right to know. Why the shooting? Why the cover-up? You know, Senator Bert Bye from Indiana had a bill that lay dormant for nearly a year in committee. A bill, if you read it, you would see it would outlaw nearly every type of handgun in this country. And yet, after the shooting of a conservative candidate, Birchby was able to make an emotional pitch to the conservative opposition to that type of legislation and get that bill through committee. The logic is something like this. Even though Arthur Bremer violated some 6 or 7 different laws pertaining to the transportation, use, and possession of a weapon in Laurel, Maryland that day, if there had been one more law in the books, he would have obeyed that one. But perhaps the most frightening aspect of this whole case was the fact that the American people were denied a choice. This was something that happened when John Kennedy was shot, when Bobby Kennedy was shot, when George Wallace was shot. Because whether we agree or not politically with any of the backers of any of these candidates, they supported those individuals, and they were denied the candidate of their choice in an upcoming election. More frighteningly, the American public as a whole was denied a free election. The free electoral process was disrupted in this country by a conspiracy that would be happy to see and plans to see the day soon when there will be no free elections in this country. But the conspiracy involved here is a frightening one not because it can simply go out and recruit people to shoot, but because of what it has in mind, why it is doing these things. You know, if I could be any place that I would really like to be right now, I would be at home with my 2 kids. And I'd have one on each knee, and we'd be sitting in front of the fireplace, because I'm so sick of talking about Arthur Bremer every night, 7 days a week, and all day long, that when he gets out next year, I might just punch him in the nose. But I can't go home right now. You know, I've been on both sides. I can remember the nights that I would come home sick, physically sick, after watching the bombs being built, after listening to the plans to shoot down police officers in the street. I've been there. Think for a moment what will happen if we lose, and forget what will happen to me, forget what will happen to you. Take a look, those of you who can see him, at the little boy sleeping over here, in about the 3rd row on that side. Think about that little boy and the other little ones that you see crossing the streets every day with their lunch buckets to get to school, or the ones that don't even go to school yet. Think what it will mean to them if we lose this battle. That's why I'm here tonight. That's why I can't go home. I can't go home and look at my wife and look at my 2 children, look them in the eyes and say to my wife, honey, I knew it meant becoming controversial. They told me it might even be bad for business. So, honey, I'm not going to get involved. I can't tell them that. And even with the attempts on our lives, I can't go home and say that, and they wouldn't want me to. We'd rather die on our feet than live on our knees.